My son sold the house I raised him in exactly 6 days after I lowered his father into the ground, and he signed the papers with a pen I had given him for his college graduation. I want you to sit with that number for a moment, the way I had to sit with it. 6 days, not 6 months, not even 6 weeks. 6 days after the church ladies folded the last casserole dish into my arms and told me to call if I needed anything, my only child had already shaken hands with a stranger in a glass office downtown and traded away the only home our family ever owned. My name is Naomi Ruth Calloway. I am 69 years old, and I am going to tell you exactly how my boy Desmond stood in my kitchen with another man's check in his pocket and told me to start packing, and how he never once thought to read whose name was still printed on that deed. He thought the house was his to sell. It was not. And before this story is finished, you are going to understand precisely why that one piece of paper, the one nobody bothered to read, was the quietest, heaviest thing in that entire house. But I am getting ahead of myself, and that is not how I do things. I never have been a woman who skips to the end. So let me take you back to the cold part first, because you cannot understand the warmth that came after unless you have walked through the cold the way I did. My husband's name was Elijah Calloway, and for 41 years that man was the steadiest thing in my life. We were married on a Saturday in June with $17 between us and a borrowed Buick that overheated on the way to the courthouse, and we laughed about that overheated radiator at every anniversary dinner for 4 decades. Elijah was a long-haul man for the first part of our marriage, then a dispatcher when his knees gave out, and then for the last 20 years he ran a small repair garage off Route 9 that he opened with money we scraped together one careful dollar at a time. He was not a rich man by the world's accounting, but he was a man who paid attention, and that is its own kind of fortune, the kind the world does not put on a balance sheet. We bought our house on Marigold Lane in the spring of 1981. I remember the day we signed for it because I wore my good blue dress, and my hands would not stop shaking when I held the pen. It was a narrow 2-story with green shutters and a porch that sagged on the left side, and the realtor told us plainly that the furnace was on its last legs, and the roof had maybe 10 good years in it. We bought it anyway. We bought it because when I stood in the empty front room that smelled like old paint and somebody else's cooking, Elijah took my hand and said, quiet so the realtor would not hear, "Naomi, this is where our children grow up." We had been trying for a baby for 3 years by then with nothing but heartbreak to show for it. He said it like a promise to God. And 11 months after we moved in, our son Desmond Elijah Calloway was born in the back bedroom of that house because the storm that night was too bad to drive through. And Elijah delivered him himself with the midwife shouting instructions over the telephone. So when I tell you that house was not just a building, I need you to believe me. That house had my son's first breath inside its walls. I raised Desmond in those rooms. I papered his bedroom 3 different times as he grew. Cars, then airplanes, then a plain, dignified Navy when he decided he was too old for pictures. I measured his height in pencil marks on the pantry door frame, and I never painted over them, not once in 38 years. Even when the kitchen got its new coat in 2004. Every birthday cake that boy ever blew out a candle over was baked in that oven. Every fever I ever sat up through, I sat up through in the rocker by his window. When he broke his arm falling out of the maple in the backyard, I drove him to the hospital in that overheated Buick as replacement and held his good hand the whole way. That house and I, we raised him together. And here is the part the world never understood about my Elijah, the part that becomes the whole spine of this story. So listen close. My husband was a careful man, but more than careful, he was a man who had watched things happen to other people. He had a cousin whose widow got put out on the street within a month of the funeral because the house was in the husband's name alone, and his grown children from a first marriage swooped in like crows. Elijah told me that story once, only once, sitting on our sagging porch the year his own father passed. He did not make a speech of it, he just said, "Naomi, no woman of mine is ever going to be put out of her own home." I thought he was just talking, the way men talk on porches in the evening. I did not know yet that my husband had already driven to a lawyer's office in town and done something about it. I would not learn the full shape of what he did until much, much later, in a moment I will get to when the time is right. For now, just hold on to this because everyone else forgot it. Elijah was a careful man, and he loved me. He died on a Tuesday in October. It was his heart, sudden in the garage, with a wrench still in his hand and the radio playing the gospel station he always kept on low. A young customer found him. I got the call at 2:14 in the afternoon. while I was snapping green beans at the kitchen sink. And I want to tell you that I knew before I picked up the phone, but that would be a lie. I did not know. I was humming. I was a wife humming at her sink, and 41 years ended between one breath and the next, and I did not feel it coming at all. The funeral was the following Saturday. Our church, Greater Mount Pleasant, filled to the back doors and out into the vestibule. Elijah had fixed half the cars in that congregation at one time or another, often for free when he knew money was tight, and they came to honor him for it. Pastor Green preached on the 23rd Psalm, on green pastures and still waters, and when he got to the part about the valley of the shadow of death, I felt my son's hand find mine in the front pew, and for one moment, one single moment, I thought, at least I still have Desmond. At least my boy is here. We will get through this together. I held his hand through the whole sermon. I did not know that hand was already calculating. Desmond was 38 then. He had done well for himself, or so it appeared from the outside, which is the only place anything appeared to him anymore. He worked in commercial real estate 2 hours away in the city, wore suits that cost more than my first car, and had married a woman named Tamsin 3 years prior in a wedding that cost $40,000, and to which exactly 11 members of our side of the family were invited. Tamsin came from money, the kind of family that says summer like it is a verb. She was not unkind to my face. She was something worse than unkind. She was bored by me. She looked at me the way you look at a piece of furniture you have already decided to give. Away, polite, and through and past, already mentally measuring the room for what she would put there instead. I noticed it the first Thanksgiving she spent at my table, when she pushed my sweet potatoes around her plate and asked Desmond in a low voice whether his mother always cooked like this. Like what, I never did find out. I just took the dish back to the kitchen and scraped it quiet into the trash so nobody would see, and I served the pie with a smile, because that is what my mother taught me and her mother taught her. You do not let them see the wound. You serve the pie. I should tell you what I started calling Tamsin in my own private mind, because I am not proud of it, but it is true, and this is a story for the truth. The first time she came to my table, she set down a little tube of hand sanitizer beside her plate before she touched my food, right there in plain view, and rubbed her hands as if my kitchen were a thing to be survived. So in my heart, where no one could hear me, I started calling her the inspector, because that is what she did. She came into my home and my life with her clipboard eyes, and she inspected, and she found everything wanting: the sweet potatoes, the wallpaper, the woman who raised the man she married. The inspector. I never said it out loud, not once, not even to Elijah. But I want you to know I had a name for her, because she sure had one for me, and I do not think his mother was meant as a compliment in her mouth. At the funeral itself, before the repast, before any of the practical things, there was a moment I did not understand until later, and I have to give it to you now so you have it when the time comes. As the pallbearers carried Elijah out and the organ played, I happened to look across the aisle at my son, and Desmond was not looking at his father's casket. He was looking at the ceiling of the church. He was looking up at the water stain in the corner of Greater Mount Pleasant's ceiling, the one the trustees had been arguing about repairing for 2 years, and he had a small, private, calculating look on his face, the look of a man pricing out a roof, and I remember thinking, in the middle of my grief, why is my boy looking at the ceiling? I know why now. My son could not stop appraising things even at his own father's funeral. Even God's house, to Desmond, was a roof with a problem and a number attached. I should have known then. The man who prices the church ceiling during the recessional is not a man who will spare his mother's home. The reception after the funeral was at the house. Of course it was at the house. Where else would we gather but the place Elijah and I had built? The church ladies covered every flat surface with ham and macaroni and 3 kinds of greens, and people came through in their dark clothes and squeezed my hands and told me Elijah was a good man, a good man, and I nodded and I thanked them, and somewhere in the middle of all of it I lost track of my son. I found him 40 minutes later in the front room, the one where his father had once promised me children would grow up, standing by the window with Tamsin and a man I did not recognize. The man had a leather folio under his arm. Desmond was pointing at the crown molding. Tamsin was looking at the floors, and the stranger was nodding, the slow professional nod of a man putting numbers together in his head. They went quiet when I came in. My son said, "Mom, you remember Greg?" I did not remember Greg. There had never been a Greg. But I was 69 and I had buried my husband 90 minutes earlier, so I just said yes. Of course, hello. And Desmond steered me back toward the kitchen with a hand on my shoulder, and that hand on my shoulder was not comfort. I know the difference now. That hand was steering me out of a room. I should tell you, before we go further, that you are going to want to hate Tamsin, and I understand the impulse. I felt it myself. But the person you should be watching is my son. Tamsin was only ever a mirror. Desmond was the one holding it up. That night, after everyone had gone and the house was full of the smell of other people's perfume and ham, Desmond stayed late while Tamsin waited in the car. He sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where he had done 30 years of homework, and he poured me a cup of the tea I do not even like, the chamomile his wife had brought, and he said, "Mom, we need to talk about practical things." Practical things. My husband had been dead 5 days. I said, "All right, Desmond, tell me about the practical things." And my son, my only child, the baby born in the back bedroom of that very house, looked at me across that table and told me that the house was too much for me now. Too big, too old. The furnace, he said, the roof, the stairs I would not be able to manage as I aged. He had already, he said, looked into some options. There was a beautiful senior community 40 minutes away, a 1-bedroom unit, very nice, very safe. And the timing was actually ideal because the market on Marigold Lane was doing something right now and we should move while it was hot. We should move. He used the word we the way a man uses it when he means you. I sat there with my untouched chamomile, and I listened to my son sell me my own removal as if it were a gift he had thought up out of love. I asked him one question. I asked Desmond, "Who is Greg?" And my son did not even have the grace to look ashamed. He said Greg was a colleague, a buyer's agent, someone who could make this painless, and that there was a party already interested, a developer who wanted the lot, and that he had run some preliminary numbers at his father's repast, with the casseroles still warm. I looked at my boy across that table, that pantry door frame 10 feet away with 38 years of his own growing up penciled into the wood, and I understood, fully and finally and without one shred of hopeful doubt left in me, that my son had not come to that house to bury his father. He had come to inventory it. Now, I want to stop here because this is the moment the whole thing turns, and if you blink you will miss the hinge of it. I did not raise my voice. I want you to know that. A younger Naomi might have. The Naomi of 40 years ago with $17 in a shaking hand, she might have wept or shouted or begged. But I was not that woman anymore. 41 years with Elijah had taught me something, and it was this. The people who underestimate you will tell you everything you need to know if you are quiet enough to let them. So I was quiet. I let my son talk, and the longer he talked, the more I understood that he had no idea, none whatsoever, what was actually true about that house. He thought it was his father's. He thought, because his father was the one who shook hands and signed the loan papers and made the mortgage calls all those years, that the house had been Elijah's, and that now, by some natural inheritance he had already drawn up in his mind, it flowed down to him, the only son, the man of the family. He had it all worked out. He just had one fact wrong, the most important one. He never read whose name was actually on that deed. I told him I would think about it. That was all. I told my son I would think about his practical things, and I let him kiss my cheek and go out to the car where his bored wife was waiting, and I stood at my own front window and watched the taillights of his expensive car disappear down Marigold Lane, and I did not cry. I had cried enough that week to last a lifetime. Instead, I did something I had not done in days. I went to the small cedar box on the top shelf of my bedroom closet, the box Elijah had made with his own hands the winter the garage was slow, and I took it down and I sat on the edge of our bed and I opened it. And what was inside that box is the reason I am here telling you this story, instead of living in a 1-bedroom unit 40 minutes from the only home I ever loved. But I am not ready to show you what was in the box. Not yet. First you have to see how far my son was willing to go, because the box does not mean anything until you have felt the full weight of what he did. So let me keep going. Let me tell you about the 6 days. It started the very next morning. Desmond did not even wait for me to call with my decision about his practical things. He had not asked for permission. He had asked for cooperation. And when a man asks you to cooperate with your own erasure, he has already decided he does not need your yes. By Sunday evening, the listing was live. I found out because a woman from church, Sister Vernell, called me up gentle and careful and said, "Naomi, baby, I was just on the computer looking at houses for my niece, and I think I saw yours." I told her she must be mistaken. She was not mistaken. There it was on the internet for the whole world to see, my home, my green shutters, photographs of my front room with the furniture I had picked out, and a price, and a paragraph of words written by some stranger calling my house a developer's dream and a rare double lot with teardown potential. Tear down. They were going to tear it down. The house where my son drew his first breath, where I measured his height on the pantry door, where Elijah promised me our children would grow, and they had it listed as something to knock flat and pour concrete over. I called my son. He did not pick up the first 3 times. When he finally answered on the 4th call, his voice had that smooth, busy patience that men use on women they have decided not to really hear. "Mom, I was going to tell you. I'm just moving things along so you don't have to stress about any of it. Let me handle the details." The details. He had listed my house without telling me, and he called it handling the details so I would not stress. I asked him to take it down. I asked him plain, and my son, in a voice I will hear in my bones until the day I die, said, "Mom, be reasonable. This is the smart move. Dad would want you taken care of. Dad would want." Do you understand what that boy did in that sentence? He took his dead father, a man 5 days in the grave, and he put words in his mouth, and the words he chose were words that handed himself my house. Elijah Calloway, who told me on our porch that no woman of his would ever be put out of her home, was being conscripted by his own son to do exactly that. I have forgiven a great deal in my life. I am still working on forgiving that sentence. By Tuesday, Greg, the buyer's agent, had been by the house twice, both times without warning. The first time I was in my house coat. The second time I was not home. I was at the cemetery sitting with Elijah, the way I had started doing every afternoon. And I came back to find a business card wedged in my door and muddy footprints, more than one set, on my back porch where someone had been walking the property line. Walking my property line, measuring my double lot with teardown potential. I stood on my own back porch where my husband used to drink his coffee, and I looked at those footprints, and something in me went very, very still. It was not rage. Rage is hot and loud, and it burns itself out. This was the other thing. This was the cold, steady thing that does not burn out, the thing that waits. By Wednesday, the locks were changed. I need to tell this part carefully because even now it does not feel real. I came home from the cemetery on Wednesday afternoon, the same as every day that week, and my key would not turn. I stood on my own front porch, the porch Elijah re-leveled with his own 2 hands in 1994. And I worked that key back and forth in a lock that did not know me anymore. I thought it was stuck. I thought it was the cold. I went around to the back. The back was changed too. New brass, shiny, the protective film still on the little screws. My son had sent a locksmith to my house, the house I had lived in for 43 years, and changed the locks without one word to me, and I stood there in the cooling October light, 69 years old, a widow of 9 days, locked out of the only home I had ever owned. There was a note taped to the inside of the storm door, where I could see it through the glass but not reach it. I could read just enough of Desmond's handwriting through that glass to make out the words, "For the showing and new keys are with." For the showing. He had locked me out of my own house so that strangers could walk through it and imagine it gone, and he had not even handed me a key. The new keys were with someone, the note said, and I never did find out with whom because I did not give him the satisfaction of asking. I want to be honest with you about what I did in that moment, because I think the honesty matters. I did not pound on the door. I did not call him screaming. I sat down on my own front steps in my good coat, with my pocketbook in my lap, and I watched the streetlight come on over Marigold Lane, and I let myself feel every ounce of it. The cold of the concrete coming up through my coat, the smell of somebody's chimney smoke, the fact that the woman across the street, Donna, peeked through her curtains at me sitting locked out on my own steps, and then let the curtain fall and did not come out. I sat there until full dark, and I will tell you the exact thought that finally moved me up off those steps, because it is the thought this whole story turns on. I thought about the cedar box. I thought about Elijah's careful hands and his porch promise, and the one drive he made to a lawyer's office that he never made a speech about. And I thought, my son has changed the locks on a house that he does not understand. He has changed the locks, but he has not read the deed. I got up off those steps. I drove to the Sleep Right Motel out on Route 9, the cheap one with the flickering sign 2 miles from the garage where my husband died. And I rented a room with 2 double beds and a coffee maker bolted to the wall. And I want you to picture this clearly, because the people who counted me out would have loved this picture. A 69-year-old widow, 9 days a widow, checking herself into a roadside motel alone with 1 overnight bag because her own son had locked her out of her own home. That is the picture they would have painted. The frail old woman, finally out of the way, finally being taken care of. If Tamsin could have seen me sign that motel registry, she would have felt that nothing was the matter with the world at all. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should. And here is the thing they could not see, the thing nobody could see. Sitting in that motel room with the bolted coffee maker and the green deed folder on the bedspread in front of me, I was not frail. I was not out of the way. I was, for the first time since 2:14 on that Tuesday afternoon, completely and absolutely clear. Because I had brought the cedar box with me. I had taken it down off the closet shelf the night Desmond first sat me down with his chamomile and his practical things, and I had kept it in my car all week. And when I checked into that motel, I carried it in under my coat like the precious thing it was. And there in that cheap room, I opened it again and I read for the third time that week the document my husband had filed at the Hartwell County Recorder's Office on a quiet weekday in the autumn of 1996. A document my son did not know existed, but I am not going to tell you what it said yet. I know. I keep doing that to you. But you have to understand, the man at the recorder's office knew. The lawyer who drew it up knew. Elijah knew. For 30 years he knew, carrying it quiet like a stone in his coat pocket, never making a speech of it. The only people in the whole world who did not know what was in that cedar box were the two who thought they were about to get rich off my grief. So I am going to let you sit in that motel room with me a little longer, in the not knowing, because the not knowing is exactly where my son lived that entire week, fat and confident and wrong, and I want you to feel what that confidence looks like from the outside before the floor goes out from under it. Let me tell you about the offer, because the offer came in on Thursday. Desmond called me sweeter now, almost giddy, the way he used to sound as a boy on Christmas Eve. The developer had made an offer. Strong offer, he said, well over asking, all cash, quick close, 30 days. He said the number out loud to me on the phone like it was a love letter. It was a large number. I will not repeat it here because the number is not the point, and I do not want you doing arithmetic instead of feeling. He said the number, and then he said, Mom, this changes everything for us. Us again. And then he said the part that I think finally turned the cold, steady thing inside me into something with a shape and a direction. He said, I've already had Greg draw up the paperwork. I just need you to come by Saturday and sign. It's all set. The senior community is holding your unit. It's all set. He had drawn up the paperwork to sell my house. He had reserved my removal in a one-bedroom unit. He had a developer ready to pour concrete over the room his father was born to. And all he needed from me, the only thing he needed, the one loose end in his beautiful plan, was for me to come by on Saturday and sign a paper transferring a house that was never, not for one single day since 1996, legally his father's to give. I have to tell you about the cemetery, because the cemetery is where I did my praying that week, and the praying is the part the world leaves out of stories like mine. Every afternoon I drove to Restland and I sat on the cold bench near Elijah's. Fresh grave, the dirt still mounded and dark, no stone yet. Just the little metal marker the funeral home leaves, and I talked to my husband. I did not pray for the house to be saved. I want to be clear about that, because I think people imagine a woman in my position bargaining with God for a building. I did not. I sat on that bench and I asked God for one thing only, and it was the thing my grandmother used to ask for at her own kitchen table when the white folks she cleaned for tried to cheat her out of her wages. I asked for a steady hand. I asked the Lord to keep my hand steady and my voice low and my heart from going to a place I could not come back from. There is a verse Elijah loved, taped inside the cabinet door over his workbench in the garage, in his own handwriting, and it was from the book of Proverbs. And it said that a soft answer turns away wrath. He believed that. He fixed cars for 40 years on a soft answer. And sitting on that cold bench, I made up my mind that whatever happened on Saturday, my son was going to get a soft answer from me. Not because he deserved one, because Elijah deserved to have raised a wife who could give one. The reckoning would not need my voice raised. The deed would do all the shouting that needed doing. I just needed the steady hand. So when Desmond called again on Friday to confirm, I gave him the soft answer he expected. I said, all right, Desmond, Saturday. I said it calm. I said it gentle. I even let a little tiredness into my voice, a little of the defeated old woman that he so badly wanted to hear, because I had learned that week that the kindest thing you can do for a man who has counted you out is to let him keep counting you out right up until the moment it is too late. He said, I love you, Mom. This is the right thing. And he hung up before I could decide whether to answer. Now I want to tell you about the birthday, because I have been carrying it this whole time, and it is time to set it down and it is the smallest cruelty of all the cruelties. And somehow it is the one that I still feel in the soft part of my chest when the house is quiet at night. My birthday is the 11th of November. Elijah died on the 14th of October. So my first birthday as a widow fell just 28 days after I buried my husband, and it fell, by the calendar's cruel arithmetic, smack in the middle of the week my son was selling the house out from under me. I did not expect a party. God knows I did not want one. But Desmond, every single year of his life, even the years he was angry at me, even the year he forgot until the last minute and panicked, had always found a way to mark it. A call, a card, something. His father raised him to it. Elijah used to stand behind him when he was small and help his little hands write Happy Birthday, Mom in crayon. And that crayon Happy Birthday, Mom, water-stained and 40 years old, was in the cedar box too, because some things you keep. I spent my 69th birthday alone in room 114 of the Sleep Right Motel. I told myself all day that he was busy. He was closing the biggest deal of his life, after all, the deal of selling his mother's house. I told myself the phone would ring. I made myself a cup of the bad bolted coffee maker coffee, and I sat on the edge of the bed and I watched the news and then a game show and then the news again, and I kept my phone face up on the bedspread next to Elijah's cedar box, and I waited. People from church called. Sister Vernell called to sing to me, off-key and beautiful, and I cried a little at that one, the good kind of crying. 2 of my old friends from the choir called. The lady who used to do my hair called. The phone rang all day with people who loved me. It did not ring with my son, and I want to tell you the exact time, because the time is the part that does something to me. At 11:56 at night, 4 minutes before my birthday ended forever, with the motel sign flickering pink through the curtain gap, and the cedar box closed on the pillow. Beside me, my phone finally lit up. My heart did a foolish, hopeful thing. It leapt. 69 years old and locked out of my own house, and my heart still leapt for that boy. It was a text message from Desmond. 3 words. Still on Saturday? That was all. Not happy birthday, not even my name. Not a single word about the day, about his father, about anything but the paperwork. Still on Saturday? Sent at 11:56 at night because some part of him, some buried clerk's part, wanted confirmation before close of business, even on the night of his mother's birthday, which he did not remember was his mother's birthday at all. I read it 4 times. The clock ticked past midnight while I read it, and my birthday ended, and I had not heard one word from my only child except a question about whether I was still going to come sign away my home. I turned the phone face down. I did not answer it that night. And do you know what I kept thinking about in the long hour after that text came in? I kept thinking about a Sunday dinner from 2 years back, the last big one we all had together before Elijah got sick the first time. Desmond and the inspector had driven up, and over dessert Tamsin had laughed about something, some little joke at my expense. I have honestly forgotten what. Something about how I still kept my money in a coffee can and did not believe in the stock market. And my son had laughed along with her. That is the part I kept turning over in room 114. Not her laughing, hers I expected, his. My boy sat at the table his father built, ate the pie I baked, and laughed along with his wife at the foolish old country woman who kept her money in a can and did not understand finance. They thought I did not understand finance. They thought I was a coffee can woman. And maybe I was. But a coffee can woman who has been married 41 years to a careful man learns 1 or 2 things about how the world really holds onto what it owns. And one of those things was sitting in a cedar box on the nightstand, recorded and witnessed and lawful, while the 2 of them slept soundly in their beautiful house, certain to the bone that they were the ones who understood money. They had the suits. They had the city job and the $40,000 wedding and the developer on the line. And I had one piece of paper that none of it could touch. We would see on Saturday which one of us understood finance. And I sat in the dark of that cheap room, and I did the math of my whole life. 41 years of marriage, 38 years of motherhood, 43 years in a house I bought with shaking hands in a good blue dress, 10,000 dinners, 1,000 fevers, 1 son born in a back bedroom in a storm, raised on pencil marks and birthday cakes, who had grown into a man who could not spare 3 words of love on his mother's birthday, but had plenty of words, smooth and patient and final, to put her out of her home. And I did not weep, I had wept my ration. What I did instead, alone in room 114 with the pink sign flickering and my husband's careful handiwork on the pillow, was decide. I decided quietly. That is the only way I know how to do anything that matters. I have never trusted a loud decision. Loud decisions are usually just feelings wearing a costume. This was not a feeling. This was the cold, steady thing finally finding its shape, and its shape was simple. I was going to go to that meeting on Saturday. I was going to sit down at whatever shiny table Greg the buyer's agent had reserved, across from my son and his bored wife and a developer ready to pour concrete on his father's birthplace. I was going to let them slide the papers across the table. And then I was going to do the one thing not a single one of them had thought to do in the entire week they spent dividing up my life. I was going to make them read the deed. Because here is what my son never understood, sitting in his expensive suit with his preliminary numbers and his changed locks and his 11:56 text message. A house is not yours because you decide it is yours. A house is not yours because your father shook the hands and signed the loan. A house is not yours because you are the son and you have already spent the money in your mind. A house is yours, in the eyes of every court in this country, because your name, your actual living name, is written on a piece of paper filed in a county office, in ink, witnessed, recorded, and lawful. And my son had never once, in all his careful scheming, gone to that county office and pulled the record and read whose name was actually there. He assumed. He assumed his way right past the single most important fact in the entire transaction, the way confident men do, the way men who have decided an old woman is furniture always do. I knew whose name was on that deed. I had known for 30 years. My husband made sure of it on a quiet weekday in 1996, and he never made a speech about it, and he carried it like a stone in his coat, all the way to the grave, and the only place that name had been written down was the county recorder's office in a single original copy folded inside a cedar box that a frail counted-out widow had carried into a roadside motel under her coat. I closed the box. I set it on the nightstand. I turned off the lamp. And in the dark of room 114, 29 days a widow, locked out of my own home, forgotten on my own birthday by my own child. I was not afraid, and I was not broken, and I was not the woman they thought they were burying along with my husband. I was calm. I was clear. And for the first time in 9 terrible days, I slept all the way through the night because I knew exactly what was coming on Saturday, and not one single person who had counted me out had any idea at all. They thought they were taking the house from a woman who had nothing left. They never read whose name was still on the deed. The funeral flowers were still alive on the kitchen table when I started pulling the boxes down from the top of the bedroom closet. I had told myself I would wait a respectable while before I touched any of Elijah's things, the way a grieving woman is supposed to. But the morning my son Tobias stood in my driveway and told a stranger in a gray suit that the house would be move-in ready by the end of the month, waiting stopped being a luxury I could afford. So I climbed onto the little wooden step stool my husband had built me with his own 2 hands back in 1979. And I reached up into the dark, and I brought down the first of the gray banker's boxes he had labeled in his careful block letters, and I sat down on the edge of the bed where he had slept beside me for 41 years, and I opened it. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I was not a woman who knew the law. I had spent my whole working life as a cafeteria cook at Lincoln Elementary, ladling out chicken and rice to children who called me Miss Ruthie and meant it kindly, and the closest I had ever come to a legal document was the day Elijah and I signed our marriage license at the courthouse downtown with my sister, Pernella, standing up beside us in a yellow dress. I did not own a single suit. I had never sat across a desk from a lawyer in my life. But I knew my husband. I knew the man, and I knew that he did not throw away a single piece of paper that had ever mattered. And I knew that whatever he had hidden in those boxes, he had hidden it on purpose and for a reason, the same way he did everything. The first box was mostly church. 40 years of Sunday bulletins from Mount Calvary, every program from every Easter pageant, the order of service from the day Tobias was baptized with a water stain shaped like a thumbprint on the corner. I had to set those aside and breathe for a minute. There was a photograph tucked inside a bulletin from 1988. Elijah in his choir robe with his arm around my shoulder, both of us so young it made my chest ache, and on the back in his hand it said, "Ruth and me," the year we paid off the church mortgage early. I remembered that year. I remembered we ate beans for 2 months so the building fund would not fall short. I set the photograph on the nightstand, face up, so he could watch me. The second box was the one. I knew it the moment I lifted the lid because the smell of it was different, drier, older, the smell of a manila envelope that has not been opened in a very long time. And there, underneath the warranty for a refrigerator we had not owned since the Clinton administration, and a stack of paid utility bills from before Tobias was born was a flat envelope sealed with 3 words written across the front in Elijah's block letters: the house, Ruth. My hands were not steady when I opened it. I will not pretend they were. Inside was the original warranty deed to 4418 Hartwell Street, the house I was sitting inside of, the house my son had already promised to a man named Garrett Vance for a closing date of June the 29th. And I read it once, and I did not understand it, and I read it a second time slower, moving my finger under the words the way I used to help the second graders read, and when I got to the line that mattered, I read it out loud to the empty room. The grantee of record was Ruth Naomi Castello. Me, only me, not Elijah and Ruth Castello, husband and wife, joint tenants with right of survivorship, which is what I had assumed for 41 years, it must say, the way you assume the sun will come up, just my name. The house had been deeded into my name alone in the spring of 1981, and I had no memory of it, none. And I sat there holding the proof of it with my heart going so hard I could hear it. Now I have to tell you why, because the why is the whole spine of this thing, and because if I do not tell you, you will think the way Tobias thought, that some old woman got lucky and found a piece of paper. It was not luck, it was the most deliberate thing my husband ever did, and he did it 45 years before he needed it. Before I tell you what Elijah knew that I did not, let me ask you something, because I have a feeling some of you are sitting there with a box of your own in a closet, papers a husband or a mother or a father left behind that you have never had the heart to open. Have you ever found out, too late to thank them, that the person you loved was protecting you the entire time, in a way you never saw? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, and tonight I especially want to hear from you. Now let me take you back to the spring of 1981. We had been married 11 years and we were poor in the particular way that proud black families were poor in that decade, which is to say we were never behind on anything and we never had a dime left over either. Elijah worked the loading dock at the Reynolds plant and I was already at the school, and between us we had scraped together a down payment on a little 3-bedroom on Hartwell Street that needed a new roof and a furnace and a great deal of prayer. And the week before we were to close, my husband came home from work walking slow, and he sat me down at the kitchen table, and he told me what had happened to his uncle Cornelius. I had never met Cornelius. He had died before I came into the family. But the story, the way Elijah told it that night, went like this. Cornelius and his wife Adela had bought a house in the same way we were about to, on a dock worker's wages and a dream, and they had put it in Cornelius's name because that was simply how it was done then. The man's name on the man's house. And Cornelius had a son from before the marriage, a grown son named Floyd who was no good, who drank and who borrowed and who disappeared for years at a stretch. And when Cornelius died, Floyd came back. He came back with a lawyer and a stack of papers, and because the house was in Cornelius's name and Floyd was Cornelius's blood and there was no will, Floyd was able to do a thing to Adela that I did not even know was possible. He forced the sale of the house out from under the widow, who had lived in it for 30 years. He sold the roof off of his own stepmother's head and split the money, and Adela died 2 years later in a rented room. Elijah was a boy when it happened, and he watched his great-aunt Adela go from a homeowner to a charity case in one summer, and he never forgot it, and he never told a soul that he carried it. So when we sat at that kitchen table in 1981, my husband looked at me and he said something I am only now, at 69 years old, able to understand the full weight of. He said, "Ruth, I want this house in your name, just yours." And I argued with him, I will be honest, because to me it felt like he was holding himself outside of our own home, like a man who keeps one foot out the door, and I told him so. And he took both my hands across that table and he said, "A man can die, a man can get hurt on a dock and never come home. And if I am gone, I do not ever want anybody, not the bank and not the family and not the law, to be able to put you out of your own house." He said, "This is not me leaving the house. This is me building you a wall nobody can climb." And then he said the thing I have repeated to myself 10,000 times since the morning Tobias stood in my driveway. He said, "You will never have to ask anybody's permission to come home." And I let him do it. I signed the papers at the closing and I never thought about it again, not once in 45 years, because the wall he built was invisible, and I lived behind it in perfect safety, and I never had reason to go looking for it. He paid that mortgage with me beside him every single month, but the deed, the legal title, the name of record, stayed mine and mine alone. He kept the original deed in that sealed envelope in the closet for the better part of half a century, The way a man keeps a fire extinguisher he prays he will never have to use. And the week after I buried him, his son tried to set the house on fire without ever once checking the wall his father had built. There was more in that envelope than the deed. I want to tell you about it, because my husband did not do anything halfway, and the things he tucked in behind that deed told me he had thought this through to the last inch. There was a copy of the recorded mortgage and, paper clipped to it, the final payment stub from August of 2003, stamped paid, the month we burned the note in the backyard barbecue pit while Tobias rolled his eyes at our celebrating. There was a single sheet, handwritten, a list in Elijah's block letters of every major repair we had ever made, and the year, the roof in 1986, the furnace in 1994, the foundation work in 2011, as if he were building a record that this house had been kept alive by our hands and our money and nobody else's. And there was one more thing, at the very bottom, a short letter folded in thirds with my name on the outside. I did not read it that first morning. I could not. I held it and I knew his handwriting and I put it back in the envelope because I knew that whatever Elijah had to say to me from the other side of the grave, I was going to need to be a great deal stronger than I was that morning to bear it, and I made myself a promise that I would not open it until the thing was finished, until the wall was proven, until I had earned the right to hear what he had to tell me. That letter sat in the folder through everything that came next, sealed, waiting, and I will tell you when I opened it, but it was not yet. I want to be careful here, because I have heard people tell stories like this and turn into something ugly, and I promised my husband at his grave that I would not become ugly over money or over a house or even over my own child. So let me tell you about my child plainly, without venom, the way you tell a doctor a symptom. Tobias was our only one, born late in 1985, when I had nearly given up hoping. We spoiled him, I will own that. We gave him things we had never had, and we told him he could be anything, and somewhere in all that giving, a part of him learned that things simply came, that a hand would always be there underneath him, and he never quite unlearned it. He went off to college on a scholarship in Elijah's overtime, and he came back married to a woman named Sloan. I am going to call her by her name, Sloan, and I am going to tell you what she did and what she said, and I am going to let you decide about her, because I do not trust myself to be fair and I would rather you be the judge. Sloan came from people who had money, or who acted as if they did, which I have learned is sometimes the louder of the two. She had a way of walking into my house and looking at it like an appraiser, her eyes going over my furniture and my drapes and the wallpaper Elijah and I had hung together one 4th of July weekend, pricing it all, finding it all wanting. The first Thanksgiving she came, she stood in my kitchen and asked me, in front of everybody, whether I had ever thought about updating. I told her the kitchen worked just fine. She smiled and said, "It has character." And I learned, over the years, that when Sloan said a thing had character, she meant it was old and beneath her, and that the only reason she tolerated it was that she had already done the arithmetic on what it would be worth once it was gone. Behind my back, and sometimes not even all the way behind it, they had a name for me. I found out about it the way you find out about most cruelties, by accident, by being in a room a half second longer than they expected. It was the Christmas before Elijah got sick, and I had gone down the hall to fetch more napkins, and I heard Sloan's voice float out of the den, light and amused, talking to Tobias. She called me the relic. As in, what are we going to do about the relic and her drafty little museum? As in, the relic still keeps the thermostat at 68 to save money she does not even need to save. And Tobias, my son, my baby that I had carried and fed and sat up with through 3 bouts of pneumonia, my Tobias laughed. He did not defend me. He laughed and he said, "Be nice," and the way he said "be nice" was not a rebuke. It was a wink. It was permission. I stood in that hallway with a stack of paper napkins in my hands, and I did not make a sound. And I went back into the kitchen and I served the pie, and not one of them ever knew that I had heard. And from that night on, in the quiet of my own mind, I knew exactly what I was to them. The relic, the drafty little museum, property in the shape of a mother. There was one more thing they did in those last years that I have to set down here so the record is complete, because it is the thing that hardened my resolve more than the word relic ever did. When Elijah got sick, when the cancer moved into his bones and the bills started coming, Tobias and Sloan did not offer to help. That I could have forgiven, because not everybody has the means. What I cannot forget is that they offered instead advice. Sloan sat at my kitchen table while my husband slept in pain in the next room, and she suggested with great tenderness that Elijah and I should think about putting our affairs in order, by which she meant we should sign the house over to Tobias now, while we were living, to keep it out of probate, she said, to make things simpler for everyone. She had the form. She actually had a quitclaim deed form in her purse, printed out, and she slid it across my table next to the casserole I had made. And she said the kindest thing. She said, "This way you never have to worry, Mama Ruth. We will always take care of you." And I looked at that form, and I did not know the law then, but I knew my son's wife, and I knew that the word relic had a paper version and that this was it. And I told her, in my bright false voice, that Elijah handled the house, and that he was not up to it just now, and I poured her more tea. She put the form back in her purse, but she brought it up twice more before he died. The last time was the week he passed, and I have wondered since whether she sat by his deathbed doing arithmetic on the closing costs. I never signed it. Thank God and thank Elijah. I never signed a thing. And when I sat with her days later and told her about that form in Sloane's purse, she went very still, and then she said something I will not forget. She said, "Mrs. Costello, do you understand that if you had signed that, you would have handed your son the one thing his father spent 45 years making sure he could never take? You would have torn down the wall with your own hands and thanked her for the privilege." I understood it. I understood that the relic had very nearly been talked into burning her own house down out of love, and that the only thing that saved me was a dead man's stubbornness and a sick man too proud to let his wife handle a deed. I tell you that not for your pity. I tell you so you will understand that when my son sold my house 8 days after his father went into the ground, he was not acting out of grief or confusion or some desperate need. He had been planning, in his way, for years. The house on Hartwell Street had always been, to the two of them, an asset that was inconveniently still occupied by the relic. Elijah's death simply moved up the timeline. So now you know what I was holding when I sat on the edge of my bed, and you know why my hands were shaking, and you know that the why went back 45 years to a great-aunt named Adela, who died in a rented room. The question that morning was no longer whether I had the power. The deed in my lap told me I had the power. The question was whether I, Ruth Costello, 69 years old, who had never hired a lawyer and never read a contract and never raised her voice above a hum in her own house, had the spine and the knowledge to use it before June the 29th. And I will tell you honestly, sitting there that first morning, I did not. I knew I held something. I did not yet know how to make it real in the eyes of the law. A piece of paper in a closet and a piece of paper in the county records are two different things, and I had a sick feeling that the difference between them was exactly the place where a woman like me, alone, could lose everything. So I did the only thing I knew how to do, which was the thing my mother taught me and her mother taught her. I went to church, not to pray, although I did that too. I went to find Deacon Cyril Mabry because Cyril had retired 3 years back from 40 years at the county recorder's office, and if there was one man in the city of Macon who could tell me what a deed meant and what it did not, it was him. I had known Cyril and his wife Effie since before Tobias was born. Cyril had carried Elijah's casket on his shoulder 8 days earlier. He had wept at the graveside, openly, the way the old men of our church are permitted to weep, and he had taken my hand at the repast and said, "Anything, Ruth, anything at all, you hear me?" And I had thanked him the way you thank everybody at a funeral, without really hearing it. Now I heard it. I called him that same afternoon, and I asked him to come by, and I asked him to bring his reading glasses. And something in my voice must have told him this was not a condolence call, because he was at my door inside the hour with Effie in the car waiting, and his glasses in his shirt pocket. I sat him down at the kitchen table, the same table where Elijah had told me about Adela, and I put the deed in front of him without a word. And I watched his face while he read it. Cyril read it the way a man reads a thing he has read 10,000 of, fast at first, and then I saw him slow down, and then I saw him stop. And he looked up at me over the top of his glasses, and he said very quietly, "Ruth." "Whose name is this?" "Mine," I said. "Only mine." He sat back in the chair. He took the glasses off. And then this old deacon, this retired county clerk who had handled more property records than any man I ever knew, said a word I had never once heard him say in 40 years of church. And then he begged my pardon for saying it. And then he laughed. A short, hard bark of a laugh with no meanness in it, only wonder. He said, "Elijah Costello, 45 years. He said, "That man was smarter than every lawyer that ever charged me $300 an hour." And then the laugh went out of his face and he got serious. And he leaned across the table. And he started to teach me, slow and patient, the way you would teach a child to read. what exactly it was that I was holding. He told me that a deed is the proof of who owns a thing, but that the proof only has power if it is on file where the world can see it, in the records of the county, recorded and indexed and dated. He asked me if I knew whether the deed had ever been recorded, and I told him I did not know what that meant, and he was kind about it. He said we would find out together, and not to worry, because he still knew every soul in that office, and they would pull the record for him as a favor in an afternoon. He told me that if my name was the name on file, then under the law, my son could no more sell that house than he could sell the courthouse. He said, a man cannot sell what he does not own, Ruth. He cannot sign away your house any more than he can sign away your right hand. Whatever paper Tobias signed with that buyer, whatever earnest money changed hands, it is air. It is a promise to deliver a thing that was never his to deliver. And then he told me the part that mattered most, the part that turned this from a feeling in my chest into a plan I could act on. He said the danger was not the law. The law was on my side and would stay on my side. The danger was time and silence. He said if I sat quiet and did nothing, and the closing went forward on June the 29th, and money changed hands and a new deed got signed and handed to this buyer, then even though that new deed would be worthless, I would be the one who had to prove it. I would be the one dragged into a courtroom to untangle it. The mess would land on the relic, not on the boy who made it. He said, you do not want to be cleaning this up after. You want to stop it before. You want to be standing in the road before the truck ever gets here, with the title in your hand and a lawyer beside you, so that everybody, your son, the buyer, the title company, every last one of them, knows the truth before $1 moves. I asked him how a woman like me does a thing like that, and Cyril Mabry, God keep him, took out a pen and a church envelope from his pocket, and he started writing down names. He wrote down the name of a lawyer, not just any lawyer, a young woman named Adaeze Okonkwo who attended the AME church across town and whose mother, Cyril had known for years, a real estate attorney, the kind who lived and breathed exactly this, deeds and titles and closings. He wrote her name and her number on the back of that church envelope and he slid it across the table to me, and he said, you call her Monday morning. You tell her Cyril Mabry sent you, and you let her be your wall now the same as Elijah was. I want to pause on that, because I think it is the thing I most want you to carry away from the middle of this story before the hard part comes. I had spent 8 days believing I was alone. I had buried my husband and listened to my son auction off my home, and I had felt, sitting on the edge of that bed like the last living thing in a house full of ghosts. And it was not true. It had never been true. My husband had been protecting me for 45 years from inside a sealed envelope. My church had carried his casket, and now it was going to carry me. And there was a young lawyer across town I had never met who was about to become the strongest friend I had. I was not alone. I had only been treated as if I were, which is a different thing entirely, and the difference was about to become the most important fact of all our lives. I did not sleep much that weekend. I sat up in Elijah's chair with the deed in a folder on my lap, and I read it until I had it by heart, and I prayed. And around 2 in the morning on Sunday, I did something I am not ashamed of. I talked to him. I sat in my husband's chair and I held his deed and I said out loud into the dark, you built me a wall and you never told me, you stubborn man, and now I have got to learn how to stand on top of it, and I am scared. And I did not get an answer, of course, because that is not how it works. But I will tell you that around the time the sky started to go gray, I felt something settle in me, something hard and quiet, like the floor of a deep well. And when I got up to make my coffee, my hands had stopped shaking, and they did not shake again, not through any of what came next. Monday morning at 9 o'clock sharp, I called the number on the church envelope. Adaeze Okonkwo answered her own phone, which I would learn was rare for a lawyer. And when I said the words Cyril Mabry sent me, her whole voice changed, warmed, the way you warmed a family of family. I told her, in a great rush, the whole thing, the funeral and the driveway, and the man in the gray suit, and the closing date, and the envelope in the closet, and she let me get all the way to the end without once interrupting me. And when I finally ran out of breath, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, Mrs. Costello, I need you to do exactly 2 things today, and then you are going to let me carry the rest. She said, do not call your son. Do not warn the buyer. Do not say one word to anybody in your family. And she said, bring me that deed at 2 o'clock, in person, and do not let it out of your hands until you put it in mine. I put on my good navy dress, the one I had worn to Elijah's funeral, because it was the most serious thing I owned, and this was the most serious thing I had ever done. And I drove downtown, and I sat across a desk from Adaeze Okonkwo in an office that smelled like coffee and law books, and I put my husband's deed into her hands. She was younger than I expected, maybe 35, with her hair in long braids and reading glasses pushed up on her head, and a way of going completely still when she read that reminded me of Cyril. She read the deed twice. Then she got up without a word and went to her computer, and her fingers moved fast, and I watched her face, and I saw the exact moment she found what she was looking for, because her shoulders came down an inch and she let out a breath through her nose, and she turned the screen toward me. There it was, the county record, recorded the 18th of May, 1981. Grantee Ruth Naomi Castello. She pointed at it and she said, "Mrs. Castello, your husband did not just hand you a piece of paper. He recorded it. It has been sitting in the public record, in your name, for 45 years, where any human being on earth could have looked it up in 5 minutes for a $2 fee." She said, "Including your son." She said it without heat, just laying it down like a card on the table, and the weight of it landed on me all at once. Tobias had not been deceived. Nobody had hidden anything from him. The truth had been sitting in the open since before he was born, and he had simply never bothered to look, because it had never once occurred to him that the relic might own anything he could not take. Adaeze leaned back and she looked at me for a long moment, and then she asked me a question I did not expect. She asked me what I wanted, not what I was entitled to, she said. She could tell me that in one sentence the house was mine, free and clear, end of story. She wanted to know what I wanted to happen. Did I want to quietly stop the sale and never let my son know I had ever known? Did I want to confront him? Did I want money, damages, a fight? She said, "There are a dozen ways this can go, Mrs. Castello, and most of them are loud and some of them are cruel, and I have seen them all." She said, "So before I file a single thing, I need to know what kind of woman you are going to be at the end of this. Because I am going to make it happen, whatever it is. But you have got to choose it now, with a clear head, and not in anger later." And I thought about Adela, dying in a rented room. And I thought about my son laughing in the den while his wife called me the relic. And I thought, more than anything, about the promise I had made at my husband's grave, that I would not become ugly. And I told Adaeze Okonkwo the truth, which was that I did not want to destroy my son. I wanted him to learn, in front of the people he had tried to impress, that he had reached for something that was not his, and that the law and his own dead father had been standing in front of it the whole time. I wanted it done in the daylight on the record, with my back straight. I did not want to scream at him in a driveway. I wanted to hand the truth to him the way you hand a man a mirror. She nodded slowly, and a small, careful smile started at the corner of her mouth. And she said, "Then here is what we are going to do." And over the next 40 minutes, with a legal pad between us, she built it. She told me she would prepare and record an affidavit of facts, putting my ownership beyond any question in the public record, fresh and dated and undeniable. She would send a formal letter on her firm's letterhead to the title company handling the sale, the one whose sign I had seen on the contract in my son's hand, a company called Sentinel Title and Escrow. That letter would inform Sentinel, in plain legal language, that the seller of record for 4418 Hartwell Street, one Tobias Castello, had no ownership interest whatsoever in the property, that the sole owner of record was and had been since 1981 Ruth Naomi Castello, and that any closing conducted on the property would convey nothing and would expose every party to liability. She said, "The moment that letter hits their desk, Mrs. Castello, that closing is dead. No title company on earth will insure a sale once they know the seller does not own the property. They would be insuring a lie, and they will not do it." I asked her how long it would take. She looked at her calendar, and she looked at the closing date I had given her, June the 29th, and she did the arithmetic. And she said we had time, but not a great deal of it, and that we would do it carefully and correctly rather than fast and sloppy, because the whole point was that this had to be airtight. She said, "Your husband did this right 45 years ago, and we are going to honor that by doing it right now." She said the affidavit would be recorded within the week. The letter to Sentinel would go out the same day it was recorded, certified, return receipt, so there could never be a question of whether they got it. And then, she said, then we wait, because the most powerful thing I owned was not the fight. It was the fact. And the fact would do the work if I simply let it be seen. I left her office that afternoon and I sat in my car in the parking deck for a long time before I started the engine, not crying, just sitting, feeling the size of what was now in motion. I had walked in that morning a relic, a drafty little museum, a problem to be solved by the end of the month. I was driving home as the owner of record of 4418 Hartwell Street, with a lawyer and a deacon and a 45-year-old wall and a dead man's foresight all standing behind me. And I want to tell you, the thing I felt was not triumph, it was not even relief, exactly. It was the strangest, deepest feeling of being seen, finally, by the one person who had bothered to look ahead far enough to protect me, who had loved me enough in 1981 to imagine a morning in 2026 when his own son might fail me, and to build the wall anyway, and to never say a word about it so that I could live free of the fear. I drove home loving my husband more than I had loved him on the day we married, which I would not have believed possible. That week was the strangest week of my life, and I want to take you through it because the strangeness of it is the whole texture of the thing. On the outside, nothing was happening. I cooked. I went to Wednesday night Bible study. I let Sloan call me twice, and I let her use that bright, false voice to ask me, so gently, whether I had given any thought to where I might be most comfortable going forward, which was her way of asking when I was going to vacate the house she believed she was about to sell out from under me. And I said, in a voice every bit as bright and false as hers, that I was giving it a great deal of thought, which was the truest thing I told her that whole month. I was giving it a great deal of thought indeed. Tobias came by once that week. He came in his good shoes and his impatient way, and he walked through my house, with the air of a man taking inventory of a property he has already sold, opening the back door to look at the yard, frowning at the water heater, and at one point, God forgive him, standing in the middle of the living room Elijah and I had built our whole life in and saying, half to himself, that the new buyer would probably gut the kitchen first. He did not know I had heard from a Daisy that morning that the affidavit was recorded. He did not know that the certified letter to Sentinel Title was, at that very moment, sitting in a mail truck somewhere between her office and theirs. He stood in my living room pricing my drapes, and I poured him a glass of sweet tea, and I asked him how Sloan was, and I smiled at my son, and I let him believe for a few more days that he was a man who owned things. It was the last gift I would ever give him from the old version of myself, the relic he thought he understood, and I gave it freely, because I knew what was coming and I knew he did not. And there is a kind of mercy in a quiet table before a hard truth. What I did not yet know that week, what even Adese did not yet know, was who the buyer really was. We knew his name from the contract, Garrett Vance, and we knew the price, and we knew the closing date, and we assumed he was simply a man who wanted a house. We were wrong about that, and the way we were wrong about it would change everything when it came out. But it had not come out yet, and I am not going to get ahead of myself, because Adese taught me that week that getting ahead of the facts is how people who are right end up looking wrong. So I will leave Garrett Vance where he sat that week, a name on a contract, a stranger in a gray suit, a closing date looming on the calendar like weather coming in off the Gulf. By the end of that week, the instrument was complete. I sat at my kitchen table on a Friday evening, the same table, with 3 pieces of paper laid out in front of me in a row, and I looked at them the way Elijah used to look at a job he had finished well. The first was the original deed, his deed, in his block letters, the house, Ruth. The second was the affidavit Adese had recorded, crisp and new, my ownership stated as plain fact in the public record of the county for the second time in 45 years. And the third was the green certified mail receipt, the little card that came back with a signature on it, proof that Sentinel Title and Escrow had received on a Thursday afternoon the letter that turned my son's sale into air. 3 pieces of paper, a dead man's wall, a lawyer's seal, and a stranger's signature confirming the truth had been served. The wall was finished, the world had been told, and somewhere across town a closing date was still sitting on a calendar, June the 29th, getting closer every day, belonging to people who did not yet know that the ground beneath it had already been pulled away. I sat there a long time in the lamplight with my husband's photograph, propped up on the nightstand in the next room, watching me through the open door, and I thought about how the loudest thing I had done all week was pour my son a glass of sweet tea. Everything that mattered had happened in silence, on paper, with the help of a deacon and a lawyer, and a man who had been dead for 2 weeks, and was protecting me still. And I knew the silence was not going to last. I knew that any day now a phone was going to ring in my son's pocket, a call from a title company asking him a question he could not answer, and that the quiet I had built was the deep quiet before a thing breaks open. I folded the 3 papers back into their folder, and I turned off the lamp, and I went to bed in the house that was mine, that had always been mine. And I lay in the dark and I waited for the closing date to come, and for my son to find out, at last, whose name was on the deed. The closing was set for 10 o'clock on a Thursday, in a glass conference room on the 11th floor of a downtown building, and I arrived 20 minutes early because I have never in my life been late to a thing that mattered. I want you to picture the room the way it was, because every detail of it is stitched into me now. There was a long table of pale wood, polished until it threw back the gray morning light from the windows, and there were 12 chairs around it, and there was a credenza along the wall with a silver carafe of coffee that nobody would end up drinking. There was a speakerphone in the center of the table like a black flower. There was a view of the river, slow and brown and patient, the way rivers are when they have seen a great many foolish people come and go. I sat at the far end with my back to the window so the light would be behind me, and I folded my hands on the table, and I waited. I had buried Calvin 11 days before. I had not slept more than 3 hours in a row since. But I will tell you, I was not tired in that room. I have never felt more awake in my life than I felt sitting in that chair, listening to the elevator chime out in the hall, counting the people as they came. I had not slept the night before, but I had not lain awake fretting either. I had spent it the way Calvin taught me to spend a hard night, with my hands busy and my mind quiet. I had ironed the navy dress I would wear, the good one, the one I sang in for the Easter services, because I had decided that I would not walk into that room looking like a woman who had been beaten down by grief, even though I was one. I had pressed it on the board in the kitchen at 2 in the morning with the radio off, smoothing the steam down the length of it, and I had thought, while I pressed, about the man behind the title window at the county recorder's office 2 days before, a tired young man with a name tag that read Ezra, who had pulled the deed for me without my even having to ask twice. I had stood at his counter on the Tuesday with my reading glasses down on my nose, and I had watched him type, and I had watched his eyebrows go up, just a little, the way the title officers would go up later, and he had printed it and stamped it certified and slid the certified copy under the glass to me, and he had said, "Ma'am, do you want me to make you two, just in case?" And something in the kind plainness of him had nearly broken me right there at the public counter. I said yes. I said, "Make me 3. And I had carried those 3 copies home in my purse like a hen carries eggs. And I had read the top one again at the kitchen table that night, my own name printed there in the cramped county type, grantee, sole and separate, the date in 1991, and I had laid my hand flat on it the way Reginald would later lay his hand on the cold stone, and I had said out loud to the empty kitchen, "All right, Calvin, I see what you did." And then I ironed my dress, and I did not sleep, and I was not tired, and at 9:30 I drove myself downtown and rode the elevator up to the 11th floor with the folder held against me, and I took the chair with my back to the window so the light would be behind me, and I waited, and that is where this morning begins. Reginald came in, first, my son, my only child, and he did not see me at the end of the table because he was looking at his phone. He had on a charcoal suit that cost more than my first car, and his shoes were the kind that squeak on polished floors, and there was a buyer's agent behind him, a tidy woman with a leather folio, and behind her came the man who thought he was buying my house. His name was Dale Hutchins, and he was a thick, pink, pleasant-looking man in a golf shirt, the kind of man who shakes your hand too long and calls everybody chief, and he had brought his wife, who was already mentally hanging curtains. You could see it on her. She kept glancing out the window as though she could see her future from here. And then came the closing agent, and then came the title officer, a young man with a stack of folders, and then came the lawyer. Reginald had hired to make the whole thing smooth, a slick young man named Brett Conover, who I would come to think of, privately, only ever, as the Smiler, because in the whole hour that followed I never once saw that man's mouth close all the way. He smiled when he sat down. He smiled at the carafe. He smiled at me, before he knew who I was, the absent professional smile of a man who has decided in advance that everything is going to go his way. Reginald looked up from his phone and saw me at last, and I watched his face do a small complicated thing, a flicker, the way a candle bends when a door opens somewhere in the house. He had not expected me. He had, I think, gone to some trouble specifically so that I would not be there. "Mama," he said, and his voice climbed at the end of the word like a question. "What are you doing here?" "I was invited," I said, which was not strictly true, but it was true enough, because I had made one phone call the day before to the title company, and a kind young woman there had told me more than she should have, and I had told her I would be present, and she had said, Of course, ma'am, you have every right. This is a closing, Reginald said, and he laughed a little. That laugh men do when they are trying to make a thing small. It's just paperwork. You don't need to sit through this. Let me get you a car home. I'll stay, I said, and I unfolded my hands and folded them the other way, and I looked at him, and I did not say one more word, and I watched him decide that arguing with his grieving mother in front of his buyer was not the look he wanted. And he sat down. The Smiler smiled. The title officer began to lay out the folders. Dale Hutchins poured himself a coffee after all, and immediately did not drink it. And I want you to understand that in that moment, I felt nothing that I would call triumph. I felt the way you feel at the top of a long staircase you have climbed in the dark, when your foot comes down expecting one more step and finds flat floor instead. I felt that the climbing was over. That is all. The rest of it was just going to be the walking out. The title officer cleared his throat and began to read the property into the record. The address, the lot number, the legal description, all that dry music that nobody listens to, and I listened to every word of it. And then he came to the part where he names the seller, the party conveying the property, and he said Reginald's name, Reginald Calvin Mercer, and then he stopped. He stopped the way a car stops when the light changes and you weren't watching, a little hard, a little late. He looked down at his folder, and he looked at a second sheet under the first, and he frowned. And the frown was the most beautiful thing I had seen in 11 days. I'm sorry, the young man said. I'm seeing a discrepancy in the vesting. What kind of discrepancy? Said the Smiler, still smiling. But his voice had changed pitch by a hair, the way a held note goes thin when the singer is running out of breath. The deed of record, the title officer said, and he turned the second sheet around so that the closing agent could see it, and then he turned it back, and he looked, for the first time, down the table at me. The grantee on the most recent recorded deed isn't Mr. Mercer. The property was conveyed in 1991, and the surviving grantee of record is, and he read my name. He read my whole name. The name Calvin had said at the altar, the name on the deed that Calvin had walked into the county recorder's office and changed with his own two hands 33 years before this morning, the deed that put the house in my name alone, sole and separate, the deed that not one living soul in that room except me had ever bothered to read. I would like to tell you that the room went silent, but that is not quite what happened. What happened was that the room filled up with a particular kind of noise, the noise of several people inhaling at once and not knowing what to do with the air. Dale Hutchins set his coffee down. His wife stopped looking out the window. And Reginald, my son, said that's a mistake, in a voice that was already underneath, beginning to know that it was not. It's not a mistake, I said. That was the first thing I said. 2 words. I had practiced not saying more. I had lain awake the night before, in the house that was mine, telling myself, you will not get loud, you will not weep, you will not list his sins out loud across a table for strangers to chew on, you will let the paper speak, because the paper is louder than you will ever be. So I said, it's not a mistake, and I let the silence do its work, and I watched my son turn to his lawyer, the Smiler, the man he was paying to make this easy, and I watched him understand all at once that the man could not help him, that no man could, that the thing had been decided in a county office in 1991 and had been waiting in a drawer ever since with the patience of God. The Smiler stopped smiling. I want that recorded. At 10:17 on a Thursday morning, Brett Conover's mouth finally closed. And I will tell you what went through my mind in that moment, because it was not what you might expect. It was not the room, and it was not my son's white face, and it was not the lawyer's silence. It was Calvin's hands. I thought about Calvin's hands, the way they were the year Reginald was born, big and scarred and always a little stained at the knuckle from the work. And I thought about those hands carrying our brand new baby in one arm down the front steps of that house. And I thought about those same hands, on some afternoon I was never told about, filling out a form at a county counter and signing my name into a place that would keep me safe for the rest of my life, and telling no one, asking for no thanks, the way he tipped the choir director at Christmas in an unmarked envelope, the way he left grocery money in the coat pockets of folks at church who were too proud to take it to their faces. That was the whole of the man. He did his kindnesses in the dark so that the kindness could not be turned into a debt the other person had to carry. And the cruelest, most beautiful irony of that glass room was that the very thing that made Calvin's gift so loving, its secrecy, was the same thing that had let my son walk to the edge of disaster. Reginald never knew the house was protected because Calvin had hidden the protecting. He never read whose name was on the deed because it had never once occurred to him, in 41 years, that his quiet father had been the kind of man who would think that far ahead, that tenderly, on his behalf. He underestimated his father in exactly the same breath that he underestimated me. And now the paper had spoken, and the dead man's patience had outlasted the living man's panic. And there was nothing on this earth that Brett Conover's law degree could do about any of it. "That can't be right," the title officer's superior said quietly into the speakerphone, because there had been someone on the line the whole time, a voice from another office downtown. And I had nearly forgotten them. Pull the prior deeds, run the whole chain. And the young man with the folders was already doing it, his fingers moving, and a minute later, a long minute that nobody in that room filled with anything but breathing, he looked up and said, "The chain's clean. The conveyance in 91 is valid, and it's never been superseded. The seller named in this contract has no recorded interest in the property." He said it gently, almost apologetically, the way a good doctor gives you news you already know in your body. And he looked again at me, and there was something in his young face that I can only call respect. The respect of a man who has just watched a piece of 33-year-old paper do what no shouting ever could. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, and he had gone formal, which is what men like that do when the ground moves. "They reach for titles. They reach for procedure. Are you saying you didn't authorize the sale of this home?" "I'm saying," I said, "that it is not his to sell." And I reached down beside my chair and I lifted the folder I had brought, a plain manila folder, soft at the corners from where I had held it in the night, and I laid it on the table, and I slid it down the long, pale wood with 2 fingers until it came to rest in the middle by the black flower of the speakerphone, where everyone could reach it and no one did. "That's the recorded deed," I said. "Certified copy. I pulled it Tuesday. Calvin put the house in my name the year Reginald was born. He never told a soul, not even me, not really. He just did it, the way he did most of the kind things he ever did, quietly, where no one would clap for him. So whatever my son signed, whatever earnest money this gentleman put down," and I looked at Dale Hutchins, and I am sorry to say I felt a real tenderness for him, because he was the only innocent man at that table. "I am sorry for your trouble, sir, but the sale is void. There was never a thing here to sell. I have replayed the next 30 seconds more times than I can count, and I will give them to you exactly, because they are the center of the whole story, and I do not want to round any of the corners off." Reginald stood up. The chair went back behind him and caught on the carpet and tipped and did not fall. He put both his hands flat on the table and leaned over them toward me, and his face. I had known that face since before it had teeth in it. I had known that face red and screaming in a hospital bassinet. I had known it asleep and milk-drunk on my shoulder, and gap-toothed over a birthday cake, and stony at a graduation he hadn't wanted me to attend in the dress he'd called embarrassing, and now I knew it like this, white at the edges, the mouth working before the words came. "You don't understand," he said. "Mama, you don't understand. I have people I owe. There are debts, there are people I owe. The money from this house was supposed to." And then he stopped himself, because he had heard it, finally what he was saying out loud, in a glass room, to his mother, 11 days after we put his father in the ground. The money from his father's house was supposed to pay his debts. He had buried his father on a Tuesday and listed his mother's home the following Monday. And he had done it because he was drowning in something, and he had reached for the nearest solid thing to stand on, and the nearest solid thing had been me. It had always been me. That was the part that I think undid him, right there at the table, more than the deed, more than the lawyer's silence. It was the saying of it. It was hearing, in his own voice, in front of strangers, the shape of what he had become. And then my son began to cry. Not the way a man cries when he is performing sorrow for a room. I have seen that too. I had seen it at the funeral, the careful, damp-eyed nodding for the relatives. This was the other thing. This was the floor coming out. He sat back down without meaning to, more fell than sat, and he put his face in his hands, those soft hands that had never once in their life held a deed up to the light to read whose name was on it, and his shoulders went, and the sound that came out of him was a sound I had not heard since he was a very small boy. And the worst of it, the thing I will carry, is that my whole body still answered it. 41 years of mothering does not switch off because a man does you wrong. My hands wanted to go to him. I had to hold them folded on the table by main force. The room did not know where to look. The Smiler busied himself with his papers. Dale Hutchins's wife had a hand pressed to her own chest. The title officer, that decent young man, quietly slid the deed back toward me as if to keep it safe. And I sat there at the head of the table with the gray river behind me, and I let my son cry, and I did not gloat, and I did not soften too fast either, because there is a kind of mercy that is just cowardice wearing mercy's coat. And I had decided in the night that I would not hand him that. I would give him the real thing or nothing. "Reginald," I said, when the worst of it had passed and he had gone quiet and ragged, looking at the table, "look at me," and he did. "I am not going to ask you, in front of these people, why you did it. We will have that conversation, you and I, but not here, and not today, and not for their entertainment." Dale Hutchins had the grace to look at his shoes. "What is going to happen now is this. This sale is over. Sir," to Hutchins again, "your money will be returned to you in full today. I will see to it personally. And I am sorrier than I can say that my family's trouble was very nearly your loss." The man nodded, dazed, decent, and his wife squeezed his arm. "As for the house," I said, "and here is where I had to be most careful, because here is where a smaller woman would have brought the hammer down, and the audience for the hammer was right there, leaning in, and the whole world tells you the hammer is what you're owed. The house was Calvin's last kindness to me, and it stays mine, and I will be the one to decide what becomes of it in my own time, when I am ready. It is not collateral, it is not a debt stone, it is my home." And I looked at my son, only at my son now, the strangers gone soft and blurred at the edges of my sight the way they ought to be. "And you are still my child. God help me. You are still my child. So here is what I am going to do, and you may take it or you may walk out of here, and I will love you across whatever distance you choose. I am going to pay off the debt that drove you to this, not the way you wanted, not as an inheritance you spend without reading. I am going to sit down with you and a man I trust, and we are going to look at every number, out loud, in the light, the way your father would have, and I am going to help you stand back up, once, on 3 conditions." He was staring at me now like a man surfacing from under cold water. "1," I said, "you will go to the man you tried to sell my house to before you leave this building, and you will look him in the eye and you will tell him you're sorry. 2, you will sit down with me on Sunday in my kitchen, and you will tell me the truth about how it got this bad, all of it, the gambling or the borrowing or whatever it is. No smiling lawyer in the room, just us. And 3, here my voice did the only thing it did that whole morning that I had not planned. It went down to almost nothing and it shook, just once on the 3rd thing, and I let it. 3, you will come to your father's grave with me, and you will read me the verse on his stone, and you will tell me you understand now whose name was on the house. Because he put it there for me, Reginald. The only thing your father ever asked of this family was that we take care of each other when he was gone, and you tried to sell the roof over my head. So you are going to stand at his grave, and you are going to learn what kind of man keeps a promise quietly, with no one watching, for 33 years. And then we are going to begin again. I have told you I would not gloat, and I did not, and I want you to hear that there was no victory in my chest when I finished. None. Nothing that tasted sweet. There was only a great and terrible tenderness, the kind that hurts worse than rage, because rage at least lets you off the hook of loving the person who wronged you. And I was not off any hook. I have never in my life loved my son more painfully than I loved him across that table, broken and caught and weeping, with the proof of his betrayal lying certified between us. That is the thing the world does not tell you about being proven right. It does not feel like winning. It feels like grief with the lights turned all the way up. Reginald got up from his chair, and he came down the length of that table, past the lawyer and the title officer and the agent, and he stopped in front of Dale Hutchins, and that big, pink, innocent man stood up to meet him, and my son said, "Sir, I am so sorry, I had no right. I'm sorry I wasted your day and your money and your trust." And Dale Hutchins, God love him, did a thing I will remember as long as I remember any of it. He put out that big hand, and he took my son's hand, and he did not shake it too long this time. He just held it a second, and he said, "Son, go take care of your mother." And then he looked down the table at me, and he said, "Ma'am, that is a fine house, and you keep it." And he gathered up his wife and his dazed dignity, and they left, and I never saw the man again, and I have thanked God for him in my prayers more nights than I could count. The lawyer left after that, the smiler, and he did not smile on the way out. He packed his folio in quick, tight motions, and he said something about reviewing the matter and being in touch, which is lawyer, for I would like to never think about this morning again. And the door closed behind him on its slow hydraulic sigh. The title officer stayed long enough to make sure I had the deed back in my own hands, and before he left, he leaned down near me and said, very low, just for me. Mrs. Mercer, in 9 years of this job, I have never once seen a deed save somebody. Your husband must have loved you very much. And I thanked him, and I held the manila folder against my chest the way you hold a sleeping grandchild. And I sat alone in that glass room for a few minutes after they had all gone, with the river going by behind me, slow and brown and patient, and I let myself cry, finally, where no one could see, which is the only place a woman of my generation was ever taught it was decent to do it. We went to the grave that next week, the two of us, on a flat gray afternoon with the wind coming low across the cut grass and the new sod not yet rooted over Calvin's place. Reginald had not been back since the funeral. He stood at the foot of the stone with his expensive coat flapping, and he could not for a long time make himself read it. I waited. I have gotten very good at waiting. And finally he crouched down, the way his father used to crouch to talk to him when he was small, and he put his hand flat on the cold granite, and he read the verse out loud in a voice that broke on the second line, the verse Calvin had chosen for himself years before he needed it, the one from the proverb that he used to say over the dishes and over the bills, and over my hair when I was discouraged, the one that says that the house is built by wisdom, and by understanding it is established, and by knowledge the rooms are filled with all precious and pleasant riches. Calvin used to tap the kitchen counter when he said it. He used to say, "This house, Esther, this exact house, built by understanding," and he would wink at me like the two of us were getting away with something. And now his son read those words over his grave and understood, at last 33 years late, what the old man had been telling everyone all along. I am Esther Mercer, by the way. I do not think I have said my own name to you yet, in all of this. I was a girl named Esther Lou Caldwell from a house with a tin roof and 9 people in it, and I married a quiet man named Calvin who fixed boilers for the city for 40 years, and I raised 1 son, and I sang second alto in a church choir for half a century in a robe that smelled of other people's perfume, and I was, by every measure the world keeps, a woman it was safe to overlook. Reginald overlooked me. His friends overlooked me. The slick young lawyer overlooked me from the second he sat down to the second the deed shut his mouth. And the whole time, the one thing in this world that mattered most, the roof, the walls, the ground it all stood on, had been mine and only mine since the year my son drew his first breath, deeded over in secret by a man in a work shirt who never once asked to be thanked for it. They counted me out. They had no idea I was holding the whole house in my hand the entire time, and that I had been holding it not as a weapon, but as a trust. The way you hold a thing for the people you love until the day they finally need you to set it down where they can see. That Sunday in my kitchen was the hardest of the 3 conditions for him to keep. Harder than the apology, harder than the grave, because the apology was a moment, and the grave was a place, but the kitchen was the truth. And the truth has no edges to hold on to. He sat at the table where he had eaten 10,000 suppers as a boy, and he turned a coffee cup around and around in his hands and did not drink from it, and it took him the better part of an hour to begin. I did not help him begin. I have learned that you do a grown man no kindness by reaching into his chest and pulling the words out for him. So I sat, and I let the clock on the wall do the talking for a while, and at last it came out of him in pieces, the way a splinter comes out, badly, in the wrong direction, with some blood. There had been a man he owed. There had been money borrowed against money borrowed. There had been a season where every solution was just a deeper hole wearing a solution's face, and through all of it his father had been getting sicker in the back bedroom of my house, and Reginald had sat in his fine apartment across town drowning and too proud, too ashamed, too much his father's son in the worst possible way, to drive over and say the 4 words that would have changed everything, which were, "Daddy, I need help." And so his father had died not knowing, and the day after the funeral the only asset within his reach, with no one apparently guarding it, had been the house. And a realtor he knew had told him it could move fast and quiet, and he had told himself a story that I am sure sounded, at 3 in the morning to a desperate man, almost reasonable. He told himself I was going to move into something smaller anyway. He told himself he would explain it after, that he would give me a share, that grief had me so foggy I might not even notice for weeks. He told me all of this with his eyes on the coffee cup, and I listened to every word the way the title officer had read every word of the legal description into the record, dry and complete and leaving nothing out. And when he was finished, I did not tell him he was forgiven, because Sunday is not the day for that. Sunday is the day for the telling. I only said thank you for the truth, and I got up and I made us both a fresh cup, and we sat in the kitchen. Calvin tapped until it got dark outside the window, not saying much. Two people who had been through the same fire from opposite sides, learning how to be in a room together again. Reginald paid me back. I want you to know that, because the world is full of stories where the broken son disappears and you never learn what became of him, and I promised you the lights would stay on all the way to the end of this one. He came on Sundays. We sat in my kitchen, the kitchen Calvin tapped, and we put every number on the table in the light, the borrowing and the bad bets and the panic that had piled up while his father was dying, and he was too proud to say a word to either of us. It took 2 years. He sold the squeaking shoes and the charcoal suit and a car he could not afford, and he got smaller in the good way, in the way Calvin had been small, and the day he handed me the last of it, in cash, in an envelope, in my kitchen, he did not look at me like a man paying a debt. He looked at me like a man who had been given back something he thought he had thrown away. He hugged me so hard I felt my own ribs, and then he washed the dishes. He washed every dish in my sink without being asked, and at the counter, with the water running very quietly, so quietly I almost missed it. I heard my son say the proverb to himself, built by understanding. He didn't know I heard him. I will never tell him I did. Some things you hold for the people you love, and you never make them thank you for it. He learned that from his father finally, the same way I did, by living long enough in a house that was kept. The house is still mine. It will be his one day, free and clear, with the deed read out loud and understood, but not until I am ready, and I am in no hurry, because I am sitting in it right now, the night I am telling you this, in the same chair Calvin used to read in, with his Bible on the arm and the kitchen light on down the hall, and the rooms are filled, just like the verse promised, not with precious things you can sell, but with the better kind, the kind no son can list on a Monday morning, the kind that were never anybody's to take. So that is the whole of it. That is what happened the week after I buried my husband, when my only child tried to sell the ground out from under me and never once thought to read whose name was on the deed. I have carried this story for 2 years now, and tonight, for the first time, I have set it down where someone could hear it, and I find I am not angry anymore, and I am not even sad exactly. I am something there is no good word for, something close to peace, but with the ache still in it. The way an old brake aches before rain, but holds your weight just fine. And now I would like to sit with you a moment, the way I would if you were here in this kitchen with me and the kettle was on. How is your heart tonight? I mean that plainly, the way Calvin would have asked it. Some of you are listening to this with somebody asleep in the next room who you are not sure loves you the way you have loved them, and some of you have a son or a daughter whose number you are afraid to call, and some of you buried somebody this year and the chair across from you is empty, and the nights are long, I know. I am sitting in a quiet house too. You are not as alone as the dark makes you feel. So let me ask you something, and you don't have to answer me tonight. You can carry it to sleep and answer it whenever you're ready. If someone you love did to you what my son did to me, reached for the one thing that was yours and tried to take it while you were grieving, which would you choose when the truth finally came out and the power was in your hands? Would you let it be the end and close the door and be right and alone? Or would you do the harder thing, the thing that cost you more, and hold the door open one more time, on your own terms, with your dignity intact, and let them walk back through it and learn to keep a promise? There is no wrong answer. I have come to believe that betrayal and forgiveness are not opposites at all, but 2 rooms in the same house, and most of us spend a lifetime walking back and forth between them. I only know which room I am sitting in tonight, and I know it has Calvin's chair in it, and I know the deed is in the drawer, and I know my son will come on Sunday. If this story touched something in you tonight, I would be so grateful if you'd let me know you were here. A like helps an old woman's stories find the other people who are sitting up late in quiet houses needing to hear them. And if you'd like to pull a chair up to this kitchen on the nights I tell these, you're welcome to subscribe and come back, and I'll keep the light on. But more than any of that, I want to read your hearts, because I do read every single one. So before you go to sleep tonight, tell me where in this wide world you're listening from. Tell me your town, your country, the little place nobody's heard of. And tell me what the hour is where you are, whether it's the middle of your night the way it's the middle of mine, or the gray edge of your morning, or the soft long afternoon. I have folks who sit up with me from Atlanta and Lagos, and from a kitchen in Manila, and a flat in Manchester, and a farmhouse somewhere in Saskatchewan where the snow comes early. And every time I read a new town, I think, there is another good soul I'll never meet on this side. keeping me company across all that dark water. Leave me your name if you'd like, and the name of anyone you're missing tonight, and I will hold it. It's late where I am now. The kettle's gone cold and the river's still going by out past the trees, slow and brown and patient, the way it was that morning in the glass room, the way it'll be long after all of us. Calvin used to say a thing when he turned the lights off, every night for 33 years, and I'll say it to you now the way he said it to me. He'd touch the door frame of whatever room we were leaving, and he'd say, "The house is kept. Esther, go on and rest, the house is kept." So that's what I'll say to you, every one of you, in your towns I'll never see, at your hours that aren't mine. Whatever was taken from you, whatever name they forgot to read, your worth was never theirs to sign away, and it never will be. The house is kept. Go on and rest now, and I will see you, God willing, the next quiet night.